polio, we want you to think of flamingos in a breeding pool. Our scene will be a giant aviary with a big yellow pool. Okay, so now I'm going to run through some of the things you should already know from watching our Picorna overview video. You'll notice that we've used predominantly orange and yellows in this scene, which indicates that polio is an RNA virus. Also, through the bars of the aviary, you'll see the sky is a daylight sky, which means that polio is a positive sense RNA. Recall that all of our animals in the sanctuary have their Pico baby counterparts, which is drawn next to our mama flamingo here. This should be a hook for you to remember that this is a Picorna virus. Lastly, remember that polio, like the other enteroviruses, is a naked virus. And what represented being naked? That's right, the statue of David. Alright, so let's talk about some unique features of polio. Now recall that all the enteroviruses are transmitted through the fecal-oral route. In order for viruses to do so, it helps to be able to withstand the acidic conditions it encounters in the stomach. To remind you of this, we have the pool here colored yellow, which represents acid. Notice our flamingo is perched very stably on a rock above the acid pool and is hence avoiding damage from the acid. So polio is an acid-stable virus. One of the most important things about polio is transmission and where it replicates. After entering the GI tract, the virus initially starts replicating in lymphoid tissue like the tonsils and Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches are a collection of lymphoid tissue similar to the tonsils, but they're located in the submucosa of the ileum. To illustrate this, we're going to draw collections of these weird orange reeds with eggs embedded underneath them. The eggs represent replication taking place in the patches of lymphoid tissue, which reside in the submucosa of the gut, and the orange plants themselves represent the villi of the gut. And we'll sum up this entire step of transmission and replication with a sign here that reads Peyer's flamingos, caution, patches of eggs, breeding season 2 to 3 weeks. So remember, Peyer's patches are where the virus replicates, and it takes about 2 to 3 weeks. So from the aggregated lymphoid tissue, the virus then spreads to the area where it causes the most damage, the anterior horn of the lower motor neuron cell bodies. It is here where it causes paralysis, which generally happens about 2 to 3 weeks following infection. To remind you that it affects the anterior horn, we'll draw a bird that has a very large horn, a hornbill. Obviously, this is an anterior horn, as it's on the anterior aspect of the bird. It would be kind of weird if the birds had horns on their posterior. Picture that for a second. That would make woodpeckers the ultimate twerkers. Okay, so let's go into a little more detail about these symptoms. Polio causes an asymmetric paralysis, and it's usually concentrated in the lower legs. Along with the paralysis, it can cause myalgias and decreased deep tendon reflexes. And eventually, as the paralysis ascends, it can cause respiratory insufficiency from paralysis of the diaphragm. We have these symptoms illustrated here on our flamingo in the center. Notice how her bent leg is flaccidly hanging down by her side, and she's hunched over. Flamingos always have weird, asymmetrically bent-looking legs, which is why we picked them to be our avian representation of polio. Notice she also has a puff of air spreading out of her beak. This is to show that she's gasping weakly for air, which is illustrating respiratory insufficiency, which is one of the biggest causes of death in patients with polio. Along with these symptoms, poliovirus, like all the other enteroviruses, can also cause aseptic meningitis. Remember that enteroviruses are the #1 cause of viral meningitis. To remind you of this, we're going to draw in our little meningitis kid with a meningitis space helmet here on the right. Unfortunately for polio, there is no treatment. So the only way to avoid the disease is through prevention with vaccines. There are 2 types of vaccines that you need to know about. They're named Salk and Sabin, which are names of the people who invented them. Salk invented the first one, which is an inactivated or killed vaccine that's given parenterally through an injection. To illustrate the Salk vaccine, we're going to draw the epitome of sulking. And who sulks more than an emo teenager? Our sulking emo teenager has this very emo black clothes and emo hair, and notice on his black tee he has a skull and crossbones. This, of course, is to remind you that Salk, or sulking, is a killed vaccine. Teenagers are the worst, but vaccines, on the other hand, are awesome. and you should have no trouble remembering that the Salk vaccine is a killed vaccine. The other vaccine, Sabin, is actually a live, attenuated vaccine that's given orally. To represent this, we're going to draw in a donation canister here with a sign that says Savin' a Life. And Savin is meant to sound like Sabin, right? And life, of course, for live vaccine. Okay, let's talk about the downsides for both of these vaccines. The downside to the killed vaccine is that since it bypasses the GI tract through an injection, it only forms IgG antibodies. It doesn't form IgA antibodies, which, if you remember from immunology, is the primary immunity in mucosal surfaces. The oral live form creates both IgA and IgG. And so we've highlighted in the sign here the A in Savin' a Life to remind you of the additional IgA response unique to the Sabin vaccine. The downside to giving a live vaccine is that it can get shed in feces and possibly revert to a form that can cause paralysis in another person. Although it is rare, that's why the US uses the killed vaccine, since there's no way anyone can get the disease from administration of the vaccine, but you should still know about both types and what kinds of immunity they create. And that's the end of the polio video. Again, much of the information you need about polio can be gleaned from the Picornavirus overview video. We use this video to delve into the unique characteristics of polio. So hopefully you find this type of hierarchical learning useful.